All right, let's talk about grafting a tube. And this is going to be grafting in stockinette stitch. You would do this a little differently if you were grafting in garter stitch or another pattern. So you're going to have your provisional cast on one end of the tube, and you're going to have where you finished your work on the other end of the tube. Wherever you finished your work, cut your tail to be about 3 times the width of the tube so that you have plenty of yarn to work with for the graft. For this example, I'm going to graft with a different color of yarn so that you're able to see exactly what I'm doing. First, the thing you need to do is for every tail except for this one, you're going to weave in all of your tails. When you get done with grafting, you won't have any way to get inside the tube. So first, weave in the tails. Second, you're going to want to take off this provisional cast on. To do that, the easiest way is to use a smaller set of needles. So I knitted this sample with size 7 needles. I'm going to use about a size 2 to 2.5 to pick up these live stitches. And then that way I can just easily cut away this this provisional cast on. And if you did a crocheted cast on, again, you'll do the exact same thing. You'll go in and pick up each of these stitches with a smaller needle, and then you'll just release that crocheted cast on. By doing it that way, you know that you're not going to lose any stitches. So we're going to pretend like this tapestry needle is my small needle, my small circular to pick up stitches. And I'm going to start with this side with the tail. Remember, this tail will be woven in. This is a live stitch. You're going to go into the right leg of each stitch. So when I look here, I see here's the right leg of this stitch and the right leg of the next stitch. And I'm just going to go like this and get all of these stitches onto my small circular needle all the way around. Make sure that if you don't weave this one in for whatever reason, it will be a stray stitch. It's going to be a half stitch that you're going to need to finish your graft. So don't lose this stitch. That's why it's easiest if you just weave them all in before you ever take off your provisional cast on. So I will go and pick up all of my stitches around my provisional cast on, and I will meet you back here. I've picked up all of the stitches on the right leg across my provisional cast on. Now it's time to take off my provisional cast on. If you did a crochet cast on, you can simply undo your crochet knot and pull it out. I like to do a long tail cast on as a provisional cast on because it's very stable and I have a lot of control over making sure that my stitches don't fall off the needle. So I'm going to take scissors to it. A couple of things. If you use a similar color of yarn, it could be very hard to see. So the best thing to do for any kind of provisional cast on is use a dramatically different color of yarn in at least the same or finer weight than whatever your work is going to be. And if possible, use a smooth yarn like a cotton yarn or an acrylic yarn, because those won't grip your stitches. Especially if you're working in non-superwash fibers, if you spend too much time with this cast on your work, it will become part of your work. So it's always the best option to use some kind of plant-based fiber or synthetic fiber that is slick and doesn't want to grip your yarn. So I'm going to take off my provisional cast on here simply by going into the bottom leg of a couple of these stitches, being very careful not to cut my working yarn. Though I will say from experience, I've done it and you can fix it. So you can see how my scissors kind of just go right up in that the cast on edge. And then I'm just going to pick this out. You can see it's already wanting to come out. And once I have this done, I'm going to have live stitches on the bottom needle and on the top needle. And that's when we're ready to start our graft. All right, now we're ready to graft. I have needles on the top and the bottom. I've replaced my bottom needles with needles that are the same size that I knitted, though you don't really have to do that if you don't want to. Just be careful about your gauge as you go through and work your graft. So it looks like we have a lot of needles, but what we're actually only going to ever be looking at is 2 of these needles. So if we think about, we have our tube, and what we want to do is we want to graft it this way. So whenever you pull these together, you can see that we're only going to ever be able to work with the needles that are on the outside, which means that you're never going to work with this needle, and you're never going to work with this needle. So I'm just going to pull those out. So now I have the back needle from my working yarn coming out of it, and I have my front needle from my provisional cast on. These are the two needles where we will be working our graft. Ideally, you always want your working yarn coming out of your back needle. It's not impossible to do it the other way, but it's a lot easier to do it this way. And you won't have to weave in a tail because, of course, your working yarn is just going to be cut from the stitches that you just made. I wove this in a bit just to get some security for a different color. So if you've worked the Kitchener stitch before, you know that generally you're told that there is a setup round that must be worked. When you're working it in the round, there is no setup round. You just hop right in to working active stitches, because when we get to the end of our active stitches, we're going to do that other half stitch with this first stitch, which is what that setup round basically fakes. So we're going to go straight into our graft, and on the front, you're always going to knit off, purl on, and on the back, you're going to purl off, knit on. When I'm grafting, I generally keep my finger between my two needles. Otherwise, my graft tends to get too tight. You're going to want to graft looser than you'll think you'll want to, because you're trying to match your gauge of what you've been knitting out here. So I'm going to knit off, which means I'm going to go in knitwise with my needle, and I'm going to slip this stitch off. Oops, I hit the camera, I'm sorry. And then I'm going to purl on, which means I'm going to take my tapestry needle through this stitch purlwise and leave this stitch on my needle. Then I move to the back, and I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to purl on, knit off. Purl off, knit on. So I'm going to purl off, and then I'm going to knit and leave it on. That's what I'm going to repeat all the way around. So I'm going to knit off the front, and I'm going to purl on. And then I'm going to purl off the back, knit on. And as you can see with my different color yarn, you're working each stitch twice. See, I already have my navy yarn here, but now it's time for me to knit off, and I don't have yarn here, and I'm going to purl on. And then I'm going to go to the back, I'm going to purl off, and I'm going to knit on. So you can always tell, if you happen to get lost, where your working yarn is coming from is where you just worked, obviously. So you'll want to go to the other side to restart. And then if you should always see one stitch that has an active yarn loop on it on both sides, and your next stitch won't. So you're just going to continue this all the way around. Knit off, purl on, purl off, knit on. So about every 3 or 4 stitches, you're going to want to work on your gauge to make sure that these stitches match the gauge on either side. So in this case, I'm a little bit too loose, which is very rare in my case. So I'll just go through and tighten them up a little bit. If you wait until the end, you won't be able to tighten them up. So just every few stitches, take a look at what you're doing, and then make sure that it looks the way you want it to, and continue all the way around. So I will meet you at the end of this back needle, and I will show you how to close this graft. All right, I've made it to the last stitch, and so I have my knit on, but I don't have a purl off, and I have my purl off stitch, but I don't have a knit on. So I'm going to drop these 2 stitches very carefully from my needles, and I'm going to go and make sure that I know exactly where they are. There's this one and there's this one that are both half worked, and I'm going to go on the hunt for my first stitches that I grafted. My little tube is very small, so it might be hard to see here. But here's my first stitches that I grafted. You can see this one right here, this stitch right here, only has one piece of yarn going through it. Sorry, this stitch right here only has one piece of yarn going through it. Therefore, I'm going to take my last stitch here, and And if this, we're going to work these 2 stitches as if they're still on my needle. So this stitch I would knit off. So I'm going to go into this stitch knitwise and knit off. And then this stitch I would purl on. So I'm going to go into this stitch purlwise. My tail is also a little too short. I want to go into this stitch purlwise. That is going to close that first one. Now I need to find my last stitch that I made here, which there it is, and my first stitch that I made up here, which goes through, looks like, let's see, oh, there it is right there. So now I'm going to do the same with here. So these would be my 2 back stitches. So I'm going to purl off, and I'm going to knit on. And then what's going to happen is this is going to be completely closed. So what do you do with your yarn tail? So I'm going to get that completely worked. As you can see, all the way across here, we have what looks like stockinette, but this is my graft. So what I'll do here, sometimes depending upon how you wove in ends, you need to make these look a little prettier. So I'll go through and tug these in. I will, in essence, weave in this end using duplicate stitch. Remember, you'd normally be doing this with a color that matches the color that you're working with. And then once I get the several stitches in here, then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run this into the middle of the stitch, pull it pretty tight, trim my tail fairly close, and then once I pull this back out to where all of my gauge matches, the tail disappears inside. And there we have our grafted tube.